Chapter 2. The will of a man, for I have come down from heaven, not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me. John 6 verse 38. The summer I came home from college was one of the most confusing times of my life. I was 19, and like a lot of young men at that age, I thought I had everything figured out, except deep down I knew I didn't. I was wrestling with the big questions. What is my purpose? What should I do with my life? What is God's will for me? I had always been taught that my life should be dedicated to serving God, but no one had ever really explained to me how to figure out what that meant. What was His will for me? How did that fit in with what I wanted for my life? My mind was a mess of questions and doubts, and the pressure to make decisions about my future was mounting. That summer, I found myself back home with my parents, trying to make sense of it all. My dad was always someone I could turn to, but at that point, I wasn't sure he'd understand what I was going through. I respected him so much, but it seemed like his generation had things figured out in a way mine didn't. Or maybe it was just that I felt like he was so sure of his path, and I wasn't. Either way, I was hesitant to bring it up. Looking back, I realize now that this was one of those defining moments in my life. A time when I was forced to confront my uncertainty, my fears, and my confusion head-on. We all have moments like this, moments when life feels overwhelming, and the answers we seek seem elusive. For some of us, it happens in college or early adulthood. For others, it comes later in life when we face career transitions, relationship struggles, or health crises. But no matter when it happens, the questions are often the same. What am I supposed to do? Where is God leading me? How do I discern between what I want and what God wants? The story I'm about to share is not just about a summer confusion. It's about the process of learning to trust God's will, surrender my own desires, and find peace in the journey of faith. It's about learning that God's will isn't a hidden mystery we have to chase down. It's something that unfolds step by step as we walk with Him, and that's the heart of what this chapter explores. What is my will? One evening, after a long day of trying to dodge my own thoughts, I couldn't avoid the conversation any longer. We were sitting out on the porch, the sun sinking low in the sky, casting a soft glow over the yard. My dad was in his usual spot, a book resting on his lap, but I could tell he hadn't turned a page in a while. He must have noticed the way I'd been pacing the house lately. Finally, I worked up the courage to speak. "Dad, can I ask you something?" I said, my voice unsure, not knowing how to phrase what was weighing on my mind. He glanced up from his book, offering me one of his patient, knowing smiles, the kind that made you feel like it was safe to ask whatever you needed to ask. "Of course," he said, closing the book and setting it aside. "What's on your mind?" I hesitated for a moment, gathering my thoughts. I've been thinking a lot about, well, my future. I know I'm supposed to figure out what I want to do with my life, but I don't even know what I want. And then there's God's will, and I just feel lost. This was a question that had been haunting me for months. What do I want? And even more perplexing, is what I want really what I should want? These questions weighed heavily on me because, like many young men, I was trying to reconcile my own desires with what I thought God wanted for me. At the time, I wasn't even sure what my desires were. My thoughts seemed muddled, and the pressure of making the right choice in life felt paralyzing. We often talk about my will in terms of desire, our personal ambitions, goals, and dreams. For many of us, these are the things that drive us forward in life. We set goals, we chase dreams, we push ourselves toward success. But what happens when we're not even sure what we want? Or when what we want seems to conflict with what we think God wants for us? At 19, my desires were all over the place. One day I'd think I want to pursue a certain career, and the next day I'd question whether that path was even right for me. I'd feel confident in one decision, only to doubt it the next. This roller coaster of emotions and uncertainty was exhausting. I was so focused on trying to find clarity about my own will that I hadn't yet realized something important. My will, my desires, my ambitions were not fixed. They were constantly evolving based on my experiences, my emotions, and most importantly, my relationship with God. What is my will? It's a question that many men ask themselves, especially in moments of transition, whether it's choosing a career, starting a family, or simply figuring out what the next step in life should be. At its core, our will is a combination of our desires, ambitions, and sense of purpose. But here's the thing. Our will is not something that exists independently of God. It is shaped by our relationship with Him. And as we draw closer to Him, our will begins to reflect His. What is God's will? Dad leaned back in his chair, nodding slightly, as though he understood exactly what I was talking about. That's a big question, he said, his voice calm and steady. Figuring out your will versus God's will. It's something every believer wrestles with at some point. He paused for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. Here's the thing, though, he continued. It's not about trying to choose between what you want and what God wants. It's about surrendering your will to Him and trusting that He's already working through your desires, even when you don't realize it. His words hit me in a way I hadn't expected. For so long, I had viewed God's will as something separate from my own, something I had to figure out like a puzzle, or something I had to chase down, as if it were hiding just out of reach. But Dad's words suggested something different. What if God's will wasn't a distant mystery, but something that was already at work in my life, shaping me and my desires from the inside out? In John 6, verse 38, Jesus says, "For I have come down from heaven, not to do my own will, but the will of Him who sent me." This verse was one I had heard many times before, but it took on new meaning as I thought about it in light of Dad's words. Jesus wasn't saying that His will was in conflict with the Father's. Instead, He was showing us that to live in alignment with God's will is to live in perfect harmony with the desires God has placed within us. God's will is not something distant or unreachable. It is something that He invites us into, something that He reveals to us as we walk with Him. But often we overcomplicate it. We imagine that God's will is some grand, mysterious plan that we have to figure out on our own, and if we make the wrong choice, we'll somehow miss out on His will. The reality is that God's will is much simpler than we make it out to be. It's not a series of choices we have to get right in order to stay on the right path. Instead, it's about walking in daily surrender to God, trusting that He is leading us, and allowing our desires to be shaped by His. One of the things that has always struck me about Jesus' words in John 6, verse 38 is the way He fully embraced the Father's will. Jesus wasn't living in constant tension between His desires and the Father's desires. Instead, He lived in perfect submission to God's will, knowing that the Father's will was good and perfect. This is the example we are called to follow, not one of constantly wrestling between our will and God's will, but one of surrender and trust, knowing that God is already at work in our lives, shaping our desires and guiding our steps. How do I control my will? But how do I do that? I asked, feeling like His words made sense, but still not sure how to apply them to my own life. How do I know what parts of my will I should hold on to and which ones I should let go of? Dad leaned forward a little, resting his elbows on his knees. When I was your age, he said, I went through something similar. I had my own plans. I wanted to pursue a career that I thought would bring me success and security. But deep down, I knew that God was calling me in a different direction. It wasn't an easy process, letting go of what I thought I wanted. But over time, I realized that God's will wasn't something that was in competition with my desires. It was something that was already shaping me, even when I didn't see it. His words gave me a lot to think about. I had always assumed that following God's will meant denying my own will, that I had to set aside my desires in order to follow His. But what if, instead of trying to control my will, I surrendered to God, trusting that He would guide me in the direction He wanted me to go? Control is something we all struggle with. We want to feel like we're in control of our lives, our choices, and our future. We want to know that the decisions we make will lead to success and fulfillment. But the reality is that we're not in control, and the more we try to control our lives, the more we find ourselves frustrated and overwhelmed. Surrender, on the other hand, feels counterintuitive. It goes against everything we've been taught about success and achievement. But true freedom comes when we release control and allow God to direct our steps. Proverbs 3 verses 5 to 6 reminds us, trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will make straight your paths. When we trust God with our will, we don't have to worry about controlling every aspect of our lives. He promises to guide us and make our paths straight. This doesn't mean that we'll always know exactly where we're going or what the future holds, but it does mean that we can trust that God is leading us, even when we can't see the whole picture. One of the most powerful lessons I've learned about controlling my will is that it's not about trying to force my desires into alignment with God's. Instead, it's about surrendering my will to Him and trusting that He is already at work in my heart, shaping my desires and guiding my steps. It's about releasing the need to control every outcome and trusting that God's plan is better than anything I could come up with on my own. Do I follow my heart or do I follow God? I frowned, trying to wrap my head around what Dad was saying. So you're saying God's will isn't always something separate from what I want? It's intertwined. Dad smiled, pleased that I was beginning to understand. Exactly. It's not always about choosing between two opposing forces, your will versus God's. It's about aligning your heart with His. When you spend time with Him, when you seek His guidance in prayer and through His Word, your desires start to reflect His desires. And that's when you find that the things you want for your life, your goals, your dreams, aren't at odds with God's will. They're part of it. I sat back in my chair, letting His words sink in. It was a completely different way of thinking about it. I had always imagined God's will as something distant, something I had to figure out through trial and error. But what if, instead of trying to discern between my will and God's, I focus on drawing closer to Him, trusting that He would align my desires with His? It's tempting to think that following your heart and following God are two entirely different things. We hear it all the time. Just follow your heart. But the Bible tells us something different. In Jeremiah 17, verse 9, it says, "The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it?" Our hearts, on their own, can lead us astray. They can be swayed by emotions, circumstances, and our own selfish desires. That's why it's so important to align our hearts with God's will, to surrender our desires to Him, and trust that He will guide us in the right direction. When we follow God, rather than simply following our own hearts, we experience a deeper sense of peace and purpose. We're no longer striving to make our own way in the world. Instead, we're walking in step with the One who created us, trusting that His plans are better than anything we could come up with on our own. I began to realize that my heart and God's heart didn't have to be at odds with each other. As I spent more time with God, through prayer, through reading His Word, through quiet reflection, I found that my desires began to shift. The things I had once thought were important no longer seemed as significant, and the things that mattered to God started to matter more to me. How to step into God's will, that's what makes surrender so important. Dad added, it's not about giving up your desires or dreams. It's about trusting that God's plan is bigger and better than anything you could come up with on your own. And when you surrender your will to Him, He doesn't just ignore your desires. He transforms them. I nodded, feeling a strange sense of peace begin to settle over me. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about my future in terms of a tug of war between what I wanted and what God wanted. Instead, I saw it as a process of surrender and transformation. Maybe it wasn't about figuring everything out right now. Maybe it was about trusting that as I sought God's will, my own desires would start to reflect His. Stepping into God's will doesn't happen all at once. It's not something that is revealed in a single moment of clarity. Instead, it's a journey, a process of daily surrender and trust. It's about taking one step at a time, even when you're not sure where the path will lead. In Psalm 37, verse 23, it says, "The steps of a man are established by the Lord when he delights in his way." When we delight in God, when we seek Him and trust Him, He establishes our steps. He guides us, even when we can't see the full picture. I used to think that stepping into God's will meant figuring out the right choice and sticking with it no matter what. But now, I see that it's less about the specific decisions we make and more about the heart with which we make those decisions. When we are walking with God, when we are seeking Him and surrendering our desires to Him, He guides us, sometimes in ways we don't expect, setting my heart on God. But what if I don't feel like I know what He wants for me? I asked after a moment, what if I'm still confused about where He's leading me? Dad smiled again, that familiar look of patience in his eyes. "That's okay," he said softly. "You don't have to have all the answers right now. Sometimes God's will isn't something you figure out in a single moment. It's revealed to you step by step as you walk with Him. Just focus on taking the next step, whatever that may be. Trust that He'll show you the way in His time." His words reminded me of something I had read in Colossians 3, verse 2, which says, "Set your minds on things that are above, not on things that are on earth." When we set our hearts and minds on God, we begin to see things from His perspective. Our desires shift, and we start to want what He wants. This doesn't mean that all our questions will be answered immediately, but it does mean that we can trust that God is leading us, even when we don't know exactly where we're going. As I sat there with Dad, I realized that I had been so focused on trying to figure out my future that I had forgotten to focus on God. I had been chasing answers, when what I really needed to do was chase after Him. I began to understand that the process of discovering God's will wasn't about finding the right roadmap for my life. It was about drawing closer to God and letting my desires be shaped by His heart. As I did that, I would begin to see His will unfold in my life, not all at once, but step by step. Trusting the journey that night, as I lay in bed, I prayed quietly, asking God to help me surrender my will to Him, to align my desires with His. And for the first time in a long while, I felt at peace with the unknown. I didn't have to have all the answers. I just needed to trust in the One who did. The journey of understanding God's will is not about figuring everything out at once. It's about walking with Him, step by step, trusting that He will guide you in the right direction. As you seek Him, your desires will begin to align with His, and you will find that His will is not something distant or unattainable. It's something that's already at work in your life, shaping you and guiding you, even when you don't realize it. If you're feeling lost or unsure about your future, remember this. You don't have to figure it all out right now. Just take the next step. Trust that God is leading you, and know that as you set your heart on Him, He will reveal His will in His perfect time.